Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books on some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. Muriel Spark was a Scottish author and one of the major novelists within late 20th century English literature. She was also a convert to Catholicism. Indeed, she singled out her Catholic faith as a key that opened the door into a career as a novelist. However, her stories are neither pious nor sentimental. Rather, they are satires and tragicomedies, shot through with black humor. Are they simply cynical, or also insightful explorations of the struggle between human sinfulness and divine grace? In this interview, Chrisopher J. Scalia discusses this question and some of Spark's best books. Chrisopher J. Scalia is a senior fellow in the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies Department at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on literature, culture, and higher education. His new book is 13 Novels Conservatives Will Love, but probably haven't read, published by Regnery. A former English professor, he specialized in 18th century and early 19th century British literature. He also spent 3 years as director of AAEI's Academic Programs Department, where he led educational and professional development programs and events for college students around the country. His articles, essays, and reviews on literature, music, higher education, and other topics have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, USA Today, Commentary, National Review, First Things, the Washington Free Beacon, and the Times Literary Supplement, the Spectator World, and FoxNews.com, among other outlets. He is the co-editor of On Faith, Lessons from American Believer, and Scalia Speaks, Reflections on Law, Faith, and Life Well Lived. The books discussed in this episode are, first, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie by Muriel Spark. Second, The Girls of Slender Means by Muriel Spark. Third, Loitering with Intent by Muriel Spark. Fourth, All the Stories of Muriel Spark. And fifth, Muriel Spark, the biography by Martin Stannard. Links to these books are available in the show notes of this episode. And if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top review on the platform of your choice. Dr. Christopher Scalia, welcome.
Thank you, Father Dominic. It's great to be on your show again.
Muriel Spark's life was as eccentric and messy as any character from her novels. Are any parts of her biography worth knowing for readers of her novels?
It's funny you say that because some of my favorite novels by her are pretty obviously autobiographical to one degree or another. So it would be helpful to know just the very basics of her life. She was born in 1918 in Edinburgh. Her father was from a family of Russian Jews, and he was an engineer. Her mother was English and Christian, so it was a mixed marriage, and that will be important later in life, especially as relates to her relationship with her son. When she was 19, she married an older man, Sidney Owen Sparks, and his initials, SOS, would prove all too relevant. Shortly after they got married, they went off to Africa, in what is now Zimbabwe, and their marriage was not good. He was an alcoholic. He was abusive. They had a son, but she left him before long and went back to the United Kingdom. So she went to Africa in 1937. She returned to the UK a few years later. And during World War II, towards the end of the war, she worked for the Foreign Office. And she described that work as detailed truth with believable lies, basically spreading anti-Nazi propaganda. And I love that phrase, detailed truth with believable lies, because it just makes it sound like the perfect way of understanding what her fiction was all about. She began her literary career after the war, writing short stories. She won a short story award in 1951 that kind of put her name on the map. She wrote reviews. She was general editor of a poetry journal. But then she had kind of a nervous breakdown. She was taking appetite suppressants. I don't want to say overdosing, but she was certainly taking too many of them. And she was in a bad relationship with a man named Derek Stanford, who was just not. She did not have much luck with men, and this was another bad figure in her life. And she started experiencing paranoid hallucinations. When she got over these hallucinations, she converted to Catholicism. But her hallucinations are interesting. She basically thought that things she was reading, including the plays of T.S. Eliot, had secret messages that were just for her. And her first novel, The Comforters, which was published in 1957, was based on those hallucinations. She got support from the major novelist, already well-established, Graham Greene, another Catholic convert. And after The Comforters was published, it received praise from Yves Lenoir, another great Catholic novelist at the time. And it's funny because Waugh had recently written his own work based on similar paranoid hallucinations, The Ordeal of Gilbert Pinfold, one of his last novels. And he was of the opinion that Sparks' novel was better than his own representation of those hallucinations. So with the publication of The Comforters, her career really took off. And she was writing about a novel a year, including two novels published in 1960. And I'll talk about some of my favorites from that period. But as we'll see, her conversion, and especially her interest in John Henry Newman, was important to so much of her fiction. And in virtually all of her novels, she features a Catholic convert in the fiction and as an important character. She finally she ended up writing 22 novels over the course of her life before she passed away in, I believe, 2006. By then, she had been living. She left. She began her literary career in London, spent some time in New York before moving for good in Italy, where she passed away.
As you mentioned, you've been drawn to autobiographical novels, or those that are partly biographical, and each of the three novels you've selected is partly autobiographical. The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie is set in an Edinburgh School of Girls, somewhat like the one Spark attended. In fact, the story begins in 1930, right when Spark was the same age as the girls in the story. The Girls of Slender Means is set in 1945 in a London residence that bears some resemblance to the Helena Club, where Spark stayed upon her return to Britain in 1944. Fleur Talbot, the protagonist of Loitering with the Tent, is a girl whose job, pursuits, and reading interests are very similar to those of the young Spark. Did you settle upon the more autobiographical of her novels by chance or design?
By chance, I think, but it is also, I'll put it this way, I think she writes about her past, she examines her past in such interesting ways that even if you don't know they're autobiographical, I just think her own imaginative representations of her past are fascinating. And I'm especially drawn to the way in the first two novels you mentioned, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie and The Girls of Slender Means, she plays with flash forwards and flashbacks. So those aren't necessarily autobiographical elements, but they're formal elements that lets her play with her autobiography in especially fascinating ways.
The inscription on her tombstone is Muriel Spark, Poeta. Early in her career, she was editor of Poetry Review. She also published several collections of poetry. How does she rate as a poet?
I thought about including one of her collections on this list, but her poetry is interesting, but it is nothing compared to her fiction. She simply, and I don't think that's, she never gained a reputation as a poet, and some poets toil in obscurity, and that's unfair. But her poetry just never reached the height, the quality that her fiction did. But it's interesting because she always described her fiction as being poetic. So even when she wasn't really writing poetry and she was writing fiction, she always made it seem as if her basic approach was the same and that her novels were extended poems. And I think that's a helpful way of understanding her early novels in particular, not only because they often feature poetic passages drifting in and out, but also because they're pretty repetitive. They repeat character descriptions and phrases and descriptions of particular events. And I think it's almost like a refrain from a ballad or something like that when she approaches it. And she wrote in her memoir that one of her early literary fascinations was with the Scottish ballad. And Scottish ballads they're poems, but they're narrative. The emphasis is on the narrative there. And they often feature abrupt moments of violence. She said she particularly liked, I think she called it the bite of those ballads. And I think she tried to apply that same technique or trait of the ballad to her own fiction.
Spark only began to write novels when she was almost 40 years old. And she claimed that her conversion to Catholicism was one of the factors that made this possible. She said that it enabled her to see her life as a whole rather than as a series of disconnected happenings. But her novels are not tales of edification. They're satires shot through with black humor. Are they Catholic in any meaningful way, or do they lack any such intent?
I think her early novels in particular are Catholic novels. Certainly not novels only Catholics will enjoy, but the effects of grace in particular are particularly profound in her early works. I think she departs from that thematic interest as her career went on, but in her novels from the 50s and early 60s in particular, they certainly are Catholic novels. And I include in that description The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie and The Girls of Slender Means, as we'll see when we hunker down in our conversation about those two in particular. I think she is underappreciated as a Catholic novelist. I mentioned Waugh and Green already, and they are just considered the great, or among the great Catholic novelists of that time. And Spark just isn't in that conversation enough, and perhaps it's because her focus on Catholicism waned a little bit towards the end of her career, but I think she fairly does deserve to be in that conversation.
How orthodox is Spark's theology?
Not orthodox. She is. It's funny. She has some traits of Waugh. When I talked to you about Waugh a year and a half ago now, you asked me, was he a snob? And I answered that question simply, yes. I think there's a similar snobbishness to Spark. And she was kind of off-putting and difficult to deal with in similar ways. But she wasn't nearly as orthodox as Waugh was. She was more like Graham Greene in her approach to the faith. And that's especially true, I think. That doesn't show up in her earlier novels, but later on it does show up in the novel we'll talk about, Loitering with Intent. She was not a regular Mass attendee, and she, I think, could get frustrated with, this isn't true of just non-Orthodox Catholics, but she sometimes enjoyed expressing frustrations with the Pope. But she was not an Orthodox Catholic. I will say that She she for a long time lived with a female companion, and it has often been suspected that she had a lesbian relationship with this woman, Penelope Jardine, I think was her name. There's no real evidence to support that, despite the fact they lived together for so long, and Jardine ended up being the sole beneficiary of Sparks' estate. And that's a story we'll get to at the end of this conversation.
Perhaps the most significant chapter in The Informed Heir, a collection of Sparks' essays, is her 1970 speech, The Desegregation of Art. There she gives a prescient diagnosis of victim culture, virtue signaling, and some insights into the goal of her novels. She denounces art which aims to stir compassion for the victims of social ills because it cheats us into a sense of involvement with life and society. And she maintains instead that the current mission of art is to mock the absurdities of the modern age while entertaining us. Does Sparks stay true to this manifesto in her fiction?
I'm so glad you brought up this essay. As you know, I had considered including this collection of essays in my list, but decided not to. If I could just read one of the paragraphs you're referring to, I love it. She writes, "But the power and influence of the creative arts is not to be belittled. I only say that the art and literature of sentiment and emotion, however beautiful in itself, however stirring in its depiction of actuality, has to go. It cheats us into a sense of involvement with life and society, but in reality, it is a segregated activity. In its place, I advocate the arts of satire and of ridicule, and I see no other living art form for the future." And then I love this sentence: "Ridicule is the only honorable weapon we have left." This reminds me of something Flannery O'Connor used to say, or said a couple of times, which is that people emphasize the literature of compassion too much, and that to her just seemed like an excuse for all human failing, because failure is a human trait. We have to forgive all failings. And obviously O'Connor didn't believe that. So Spark and O'Connor have this similar trend towards a more, I don't want to say cynical, but that's all the best word I can think of right now, perspective towards their characters. Spark certainly had that attitude. A great example of that is a very short novel called The Abbess of Crewe that she wrote shortly after she delivered this talk. And The Abbess of Crewe is generally understood to be an allegory of the Watergate scandal. But she never mentions Watergate. You know, if she had wanted to really be politically engaged and active, she would have been much more specific about what she was writing about. But instead, she displaces the Watergate scandal and Nixon's tapping and all of that, all of his recordings, to a convent, and turns it into a hilarious scandal at a convent with a power-hungry mother superior and all of the politics that can go on in a convent and affairs with Jesuits next door. It's hilarious, but it's kind of a masterpiece in the art of detached political ridicule.
What are the main themes of Sparks' novels?
I think that the most important theme and the most consistent theme is the surprising presence of grace and how that grace can work in our lives. We'll see that in our conversations of really all of the novels I chose for this conversation. But then there's also all of her novels feature moments of really surprising, shocking, sudden violence. And so in that regard, I think it's a recurring theme is also just the unpredictability, not only of grace, but of fate and of death. one of the novels I considered including on this list is maybe the best representation of that theme, Memento Mori, which is considered really her first masterpiece. And it's a great examination of the unavoidability of death, as the title would imply.
In Memento Mori, a mysterious stranger calls the protagonists and politely converses with them, and while telling them that they must remember that they're going to die, and the protagonists take that in different ways. That might lead or lend some support to the opinion of one critic who pronounced that the main character in Sparks' novels is God himself. Is that an accurate assessment?
I think that's true in a couple of novels, especially The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. In the late 50s and early 60s, Spark was experimenting with a kind of omniscient narrator who seemed to really enjoy messing with her characters, giving them a hard time. But this was a Calvinist God, not really a Catholic God. This was her narrator in this period saw everything, and that's why she was able to toy with flash forwards and flashbacks so effectively, especially in The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. The effect of this omniscient narrator is to present it as a God who really liked toying with and even maybe abusing people. And that's especially apt for that novel because it's a version or a variation of the title character herself, Miss Jean Brodie, who sought to control everybody in her lives, especially her students. And one character in particular, the main student, Sandy Stranger herself, observes that Jean Brodie thought she was the god of Calvin.
Before we delve further into The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, do any of Sparks' novels figure in the Baker's Dozen, surveyed in your 13 novels conservatives will love, but probably haven't read? If not, is that because she was not a conservative?
I include The Girls of Slender Means, which I'll talk more about in a few minutes. And I don't think Spark would be voting Republican if she had the opportunity, even when she was alive. But that book's and some of her other novels' depictions of authority and particularly of religious belief, I think, are especially amenable to modern day conservatives. So that's why I included that.
You've already talked about Sparks' most famous novel, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. It's set in Edinburgh in 1930, and the protagonist is a headstrong and somewhat overly romantic teacher determined to mold her favourite students according to the plan she has for each. What other theological aspects are there to this novel?
I mentioned a moment ago the main student in the novel, Sandy Stranger. Sandy is part of what is known as the Brodie set, this small clique of girls that Miss Jean Brodie wants to mold and shape and set on their ways. But over the course of her time at this school, Sandy realizes that Brodie is a pernicious force in their lives and that she does more harm than good. There's also, though, the sense that Sandy is jealous of Brodie, in part because a man that's a teacher that Sandy goes on to have an affair with seems obsessed with Brodie himself. So there's some jealousy there. But Sandy converts to Catholicism, and when she is a nun, she writes a book called The Transfiguration of the Everyday. I think that's the title. It's certainly The Transfiguration of the Something. So there's this sense through that book title and what Sandy as a nun is interested in about the transfiguration and the elevation of the everyday into something transcendent. And so that invites us to consider how that happens in the novel. And does that in particular happen to Sandy? She has an affair with a teacher, a married man, obviously not a good thing. Yet, as the narrator observes, she leaves the man but took his faith. And that, is it possible for that sinful relationship somehow to be an occasion of grace? I don't know what the church teaching is on this, frankly, but it's I think a theological question or conundrum that the novel brings up. And that's in keeping with the novel's ambiguity generally. Miss Brodie herself is certainly a bad instructor, a bad teacher in some ways. She tries to control her students' lives. She sends one off to Spain to fight for Franco. She admires Mussolini. She seems to support the Nazis, and only at the end of the war does she bring herself to acknowledge that this is one of the great understatements in literary history. Hitler was rather naughty. But there are other reasons to admire Brodie, and she really does seem to care for her students. She is pushing back, is kind of a rebellious figure in a school that does seem kind of dusty and in need of some reform, if not precisely the one she brings about. And she has a real sincere love for beauty, artistic beauty and goodness, and not just kind of rote memorization. So, and Sandy, as I mentioned, though one can sympathize for what she does she turns against Brodie. That's not a big plot spoiler because we know that early on. We just don't know why or how. And we can understand why she does, but she doesn't seem to believe later in life that she did the right thing.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.